Okay, ELA 4. We're talking about literary criticism. In particular, we're really focused on reader response. The one thing I want you to remember is literary criticism, the definition we're working with here is the lens we use to examine, to analyze literature. So what is literary criticism? It's the lens we use to examine and analyze literature. Okay? Now, I did want to record it this way just to kind of show you. Notice I made my little window bigger. Normally, during a presentation, you're not going to see the little notes on the bottom. I didn't add notes to the cover page here, but I've got notes on the rest. Those are the speaker presenter notes. So, going forward, you're going to just see, obviously, the slides. But I've got the speaker presenter notes pulled up. This is what you would do in class. This is what I am asking you to do. I just wanted to sort of peel back the curtain so you could see it. They're right there along the bottom. Okay? Okay, so going forward, we said literary criticism, our working definition, is the lens that we use to examine, to analyze literature. It's the lens that we look through. Now, the lens is really like the theory. So each theory is the lens that we use. So we might have reader response theory, which we're going to talk about and focus on, but there are a whole host of other theories. We're calling these lenses. And depending on which lens we put on to view the story, we're going to have different interpretations of it. Okay? Literary criticism is the lens, a whole bunch of lenses, a school of lenses, a whole bunch of theories that we use to look at the story, and depending on which lens, we're going to see different things. So, we've got reader response is the lens that we're going to focus on, okay? So that is a theory under literary criticism. Again, literary criticism doesn't mean to criticize. It just means to analyze, to critique, to look at a story and pull out meaning. Now, we're going to be able to pull out different meaning, depends on which lens, which theory we use. So reader response is certainly the big one to focus on. I'm going to give you a couple other examples that we talk about, and eventually I do want you to be familiar with. We've got feminism, historical, there's a Marxist theory or a Marxist lens, there's a psychoanalytic theory or a psychoanalytic lens, structuralist, and there's many more. Okay, so just to give you a couple examples of these lenses. So again, literary criticism, it's the lens that we use to examine literature. So literary criticism really just means to analyze literature, to look for meaning in literature. Well, that meaning is going to be different. That analysis is going to be different depending on our lens. Okay? So, the first one to examine, just kind of quickly, give you an overview, is the feminist lens, or the feminist theory. So this is a theory that falls under literary criticism. Once again, literary criticism is the analysis, and the school, or the theory, is the lens that we use to find the analysis. So, we are analyzing literature to find meaning. Well, what kind of meaning are we going to find if we put on the feminist lens, or if we look at a piece of literature through the feminist theory? Well, here you're looking for gender roles, like maybe a male character is treated in a certain way, or in a different way than the female characters are treated. That's going to pop out to us if we're looking through the feminist lens. So the analysis we do is going to be viewed through that. Why are these males treated better in this book? What is being said there? Find an example of a female being oppressed by a male in the book. Maybe what is the interaction between a male character and a female character? That's the stuff that's going to pop out that we're going to analyze if we're looking at it through the feminist lens. We look at the position held by these characters, the male characters. Do the female characters have the same ability to hold those positions in the story? Who is dominant? Who is dominating? Who has the power? And is that power derived because of their gender? So that's really the feminist lens. We've got the historical theory, or the historical lens. So once again, this is the lens we're putting on to analyze literature. Literary criticism just means to critique, basically, like a critic. It doesn't mean you criticize, you just look for meaning. You look deeper. Literary criticism is just a deep look at stories. and we do it through multiple lenses. So a deep look at a story through the historical lens, well, here you're taking into account setting. You should remember this from freshman year, but remember, setting is two things: time and place. Oftentimes students just think it's place. It's time and place. So the context of history is important. It may not be mentioned overtly in the story, but our knowledge of it is brought into our interpretation of what's going on in the story. So you always got to keep in mind when viewing a piece of literature through the historical lens, when a particular story takes place in the context of history, and what do you know about that piece of history. So, for example, if we have a Jewish protagonist in a story, but the story, the setting, is taking place modern-day New York, well, we're going to bring in all the attitudes of modern-day New York and understand where New York is in sort of the world scope. Well, what if that story about a Jewish protagonist was taking place in the 1930s Poland? You're going to need to really view some important stuff, to analyze the story. You're going to need that historical knowledge of what was going on in Poland in the 1930s, right? I mean, a Jewish person was treated very differently in the 1930s in Poland than in modern-day New York, and your knowledge of it is going to be important. That's the historical lens. We've got some other examples here. The Marxist lens. So this is really the class system. What divisions exist in the book? Think of, the Great Gatsby, and there was the old money and the new money, the West Egg and East Egg, and how are these people divided in the story? Was Nick Carraway a part of any of these classes that were set up in the story? Certainly economics is a big piece of the Marxist lens. What structures are there in place to either keep people with money, to have money, and keep the money, and what structures are in place to keep the knots? What structures are in place to keep them wanting, to keep them lower on the economic scale, to keep them lower in the class system? Is there mobility? Can they rise up? Can you, many times in America, they say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, there's that upward mobility is a possibility. But you're going to be looking at the Marxist lens, and these are the kind of things you're interested in. Even the political structures in a story. What effects do the policies and the politics within the story affect the plot and affect the characters? Are certain characters oppressed by what means? Think of the Hunger Games and how all the districts were really downtrodden by the capital, right? The capital use these little things to keep people oppressed, like the Hunger Games, right? They would give them some bread and circuses, right? Give the people a little bit of food, give them a little bit of distraction, entertainment, and they won't rise up. They'll stay in the place where you want them. So that's going to be looking at a piece of literature through the Marxist lens. What if we were going to analyze literature and look for meaning in a different way? Well, it depends on the lens that we put on. Let's put on the psychoanalytic lens. If you know anything about Sigmund Freud, this literary school of criticism, again, this lens through which we can look at literature, because literary criticism really just means to pull out meaning. Well, what meaning are we pulling out through the psychoanalytic lens? Well, we're looking now at the motivation of the characters. What does a character do? Why do they do it? What pushes them to do it? What are they shooting for? What are they aiming for? You've got things like, the Oedipus complex, or Freudian slips often come up, or the id, the ego, and the superego if you've studied psychology at all. I love the idea of the iceberg, right? That there are things within us, but particularly things within a character that we may be able to see right away, but as we dive deeper, we might see what motivates them. We might see their behaviors. We might see what lies underneath, right? What do they say? Something only like 10% of the iceberg is visible above the water. Well, what are those things that lie within a character's subconscious that develop and those forces that shape a character? That would be uncovered, that analysis, that literary criticism, that meaning would be pulled out if we were looking at a book through the psychoanalytic lens. Once again, going back to the top here, literary criticism, well, the schools are the lenses, and what is literary criticism? It pulls out and analyzes literature. It examines for meaning. That's what literary criticism does. And all of the schools are the lenses that we use to do that. Okay, so we're always looking for meaning. We're always looking for analysis. That's what criticism is, right? You look for deeper things, and the school is what type of things you're pulling out. So next we've got the structuralist theory, or the structuralist lens within literary criticism. Well, this one might look at the narrative structure. How is the story written? Maybe it's the certain genre. Is it a memoir? Is it a graphic novel? Is it a drama, etc.? So the genre is how the book is often built. But it can even be like the structure of a character, or how a character is put together. Maybe you're making comparisons on how one story is built versus another story. So there's a lot of comparing of structures, comparing of plots, comparing of characters going on here in the structure. For example, The Lion King, that's not really a new structure. I mean, if you know Hamlet, The Lion King is just Hamlet rewritten in a different time and place with animals, basically, but the structure is Shakespearean. It comes from the play Hamlet. This happens quite a bit, that a story borrows from another sort of classic story, and it borrows from that structure. The way the plot was developed, the way the characters were developed, the way that the conflicts are written. So we're looking at how something is built. This is really interesting when we get to graphic novels in ELA 4 with Mouse. So we look at how meaning is being conveyed in the graphic novel. It's not just words and pictures. And even the pictures, you can go very deep. Is it what about the facial expressions? What about the body language? The shape of the dialogue balloon box? What about the space between the panels even? All of this is the structure of a graphic novel and gives us meaning. Now, we hit upon a couple. I gave you a bunch of different ones, right? So we kind of just quickly talked about feminism, historical literary criticism, the Marxist literary criticism, psychoanalytic, structuralism. We're going to get to reader response. That's the main one. Again, going back to the top, literary criticism, it's a whole bunch of lenses that are used to analyze literature. Literary criticism just means the examination of literature. It means the analysis of literature. And the schools, or the theories, these are the lenses that we use to look. And so we talked about the different schools, the different theories, and now I want to focus on reader response, okay, because that's the main one. So you've got a little bit of history on each one, or a little bit about what each one is. But now I want to focus on our first one. That is reader response. This is going to be our focus for our first short stories from Alexi. It's also going to be our focus for Paper Towns. Okay, that's going to be the reader response theory, or the reader response lens is the way in which we are going to view these stories in order to analyze them, in order to pull out meaning, in order to apply literary criticism, in order to critique these stories. So reader response really comes from, you got the 5 things that you have been learning about. We've got the 5 literary response types. So that is, in what ways can the reader respond? And then you've got the 5 causes of literary response. And that is, what are the things that cause a reader to respond? So let's look at the 5 literary response types first. Well, the first one is projection into character. So this is the most personal by far. The reader becomes the protagonist, or any character really, but usually I'll say protagonist, but you can certainly become someone else in the story. It doesn't have to be the main character. The reader feels responsive themselves as though they are the ones in the story. It's vicarious reading. You are becoming someone else. It is full immersion. So you guys, most of you, read The Outsiders when you were in freshman English. If you were to project into character, you become Ponyboy. Maybe your teacher at that time had you write a diary entry as though you were Ponyboy. Well, that type of literary response is a good example of projection into character. Sounds like what it is. You become the character. Next, we've got projection into the situation. Now, it's not quite as emotionally attached as projection into character. It's sort of a little bit less. This one's more about the choices, not what if I were that person or what if I were that character, but what would I do if I were there? Here, the reader still enters the book, but you're not entering the character, you're entering the story world, you're entering the situation, you're entering the setting. My example, if we were going to stick with The Outsiders, maybe instead of becoming Ponyboy, for example, you enter the situation. You know, what if your friend is being drowned and Johnny is witnessing this? What if you were in that situation, that fight or flight situation that Johnny was experiencing? So you're not becoming Johnny, you're just putting yourself into the situation if your friend was being drowned. That is projection into the situation. Next, we've got association between book and reader. Now the first two, you kind of go into the book. Projection into, I'm going to go back, into character, you become the character. Projection into situation, you're really thinking about what would you do if you were there. But then this one is association between book and reader. This really brings the story world out into your world. Not you going into a character or into a situation, but bringing stuff out. If this situation happened to me, and it really should be, if this situation happened to me here. This is the connection that brings things from the story out and places them in your world. So to be more accurate, if this situation happened to me in my life, right? So, once again, using The Outsiders with the association between book and reader, perhaps you're not putting yourself into pony shoes, or perhaps you're not putting yourself into the situation of a rumble between the Socs and the Greasers. But perhaps you're thinking about maybe a rivalry between two groups here in DeWitt. I mean, what was the rumble if not a rivalry between two groups? It just so happens they fought, and it was the Socs and the Greasers and the Outsiders. Well, again, association between book and reader brings the story world to your world. So now you're thinking about the rivalry that happened in the story. How might it happen here in DeWitt? And what rivalries exist here in DeWitt? This is a lot of comparison here, association between book and reader. Again, it's pulling the story world into your world. Next, we have the 5 literary response types. Number 4, distanced viewer. So what are the things that make up the distanced viewer? Well, it's really all about observation. Think of watching a play or watching a movie. You're thinking the thought, what will happen to them? You, the reader, are an observer. You're witnessing the characters in their world. You're witnessing the events in that world. It's a cathartic experience, right? After reading about what happened to them in their world, maybe you're a little bit wiser in your own world. So, continuing with my Outsiders example, because you saw what happened to Dallas Winston. You saw the end for that character and how it affected those within the story world. Well, maybe, just maybe, you curbed or changed your behavior after seeing it, right? That is the distanced viewer. You've seen this whole thing play out in the story or like a play, but then afterward you have that sort of cathartic experience where you are changed. Last but not least, our 5th one in the 5 literary response type is detached evaluation. This is complete separation. This is the most impersonal. So to go back, if we were talking projection into character, that is the most personal. Detached evaluation is complete separation. This is the most impersonal. This is very analytic. No emotional investment. You're going to observe the story as a piece of written fiction that has been constructed by someone else. So, detached evaluation. Think about it in this sense. Maybe you were reading a story that has been assigned to you in high school. Now, you might not necessarily really identify with it, but you are still nonetheless asked to analyze, you're asked to evaluate the text. You don't have to have emotional involvement. You might not even like them all. You can have a detached attitude towards a story, but you still have to evaluate it. That is the last one, detached evaluation, the most impersonal. Okay, so we've got the 5 literary response types. So projection into character, projection into situation, association between book and reader, distance viewer, and detached evaluation. Now, the other part of reader response are the 5 causes of literary response, and that's what we're going to focus on now, the 5 causes of literary response. Well, the first one is the self. That's you. This is pretty obvious, right? I mean, obviously, you yourself are going to have impressions, thoughts, feelings, judgments, reactions. This is clearly a major factor in how you respond, or what causes you to respond to literature, because you are you and you're going to respond. Well, another one is others. I mean, think of how many times you went to see a movie just because a friend said it was good. In fact, you probably even went in thinking you might even like it just based off your friend's recommendation, right? This is sort of that comparing and contrasting your reaction to others, what other people say. So, for example, a critic, might give a book a good review, and that will influence you. That's going to influence your literary response, cause your literary response because you read what this critic had to say. Think of a movie critic, right? That might influence you. Again, what did your friend tell you about the book? Or was it recommended to you by another? What did someone tell you about the story? Has someone enlightened you, maybe causing a change in your opinion about the story? That's my dog. Now, number 3, we've got the text itself. So we've got... Okay, I'm going to have to let him out. I'm going to pause here. Okay, next we've got the text itself. Obviously, this is going to cause you to have a literary response. Well, what is the text itself? Exactly what it sounds like. It's the story. It's the author. So things like Ponyboy and Dallas Winston, they are characters. The plot, what happens in the story. Maybe there are certain situations that come up, or conflicts that come up, complications that come up, the situation that causes you to respond. Maybe it's the vocabulary used. I can think of some of my favorite authors. For instance, Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is just so beautifully written, the way he phrases things, the words he uses to describe situations. Tom Robbins, Still Life with Woodpecker. I believe these are beautiful phraseologists, the way in which they say things, right? But it could also be the dialogue of the characters, the moods, or even the images that are painted in your mind. A good reader has that image, that movie going in their mind, that you can see what the character looks like, and are they wearing jeans or not, and what kind of hair they have in their eyes, right? All those images in your mind are created from the author, but that's really the text. The language used, as I said, the phrasing, maybe just the rich descriptions, whether they are of characters or situations or just the surrounding. We're going to read, if we do, Of Mice and Men. John Steinbeck uses some just poetic descriptions of the scenery. And then all of that, I would say, is the writing of the author. All of this is the text in and of itself. This is obviously huge. The way the story is spun has an enormous determining factor in your response to it. Number 4 is contexts. So think of the context, right? Meaning where you are in your life when you read a story. If you've ever read a book twice, my dog, he's just going crazy. I apologize. But if you've ever read a story in your life twice, I imagine that story doesn't change. The book hasn't changed. You've changed. If you read a story when you were a freshman and then you read it again when you're a senior, maybe your reaction is different because you are different. You have aged. The age you are when you read a story affects you. The life experiences you've had up until that point affect you. The reason you're reading it, was it assigned to you? Is that the context you're reading, or did you pick it yourself? Is going to shape your literary response. Personal connections. Do you have a lot of insight and connections? Does it remind you of things in your life? Well, that's going to cause you to like something or not like something a bit more. Your surroundings, your external surrounding factors. Your family history. I mean, for example, think about someone reading a story about an alcoholic. Our first story is about an alcoholic. that reader may have a different reaction if they have personal experience with the disease. Another example, someone reading a story where the main character values truth above all else. Well, I'm thinking of one of our biography, Into the Wild, that we read later. He values truth because his parents have been lying to him his whole life. Well, if you've been lied to or hurt after being misled in your own life, you're going to have a stronger, different reaction. That is the context for which you grew up, the context for where you are now, the context for your reasons for reading, the context for your personal connections. All of that shapes your literary response. Finally, we've got the process of meaning making. So think about this as viewing the book as a creative artifact. The reader is not an active agent. Perfect example is class. Studying a novel in class, that's the process of meaning making. So maybe you were reading a story and at first I remember The Great Gatsby. When I read it in high school, I wasn't ready to read it. I didn't like it, but I came back and had a class, fiction and literature, I forget what it was, in college. And oh my gosh, I didn't know how amazing the book was. The class really shaped my literary response because the teacher would have us do projects and engagements, and the way in which we studied it in class shifted my whole response. We did activities and we did projects in the class that led to a greater understanding. This is applying a lens to look at literature in a class, right? How many times have you had a new response to a book or a movie after studying it for just a little bit? Okay, so once again, we're talking the biggest points to take away from today. Literary criticism, this is nothing other than examination and analysis of literature. And the schools or the theories are the lenses that we use to analyze the literature. The examples I gave were reader response, feminism, historical, Marxist, psychoanalytic, structuralist. Now, as the course goes on, we're going to introduce some of these other ones a little bit more. Again, feminism, briefly, is just gender roles, I suppose. Historicism, or the historical lens, is the time and place a novel is set and what you know about it. Marxist is really the power dynamics from class and politics and economics. Psychoanalytic, this is that Freudian, what motivates a person. The structure, the way in which a story is written, the way in which a genre unfolds. There are some really cool books I'm thinking of that maybe take place all in one day. There's a really good one. If I were in my classroom, I could show you right now. But it tracks it like minute by minute. It'll say, from 7:04 to 7:08. And then you got these things that happen. 7:08 to 7:09, what happens to this character? It's structured in a really cool way. But the main one you need to know, besides literary criticism, is just analysis of literature. And the theories or the schools are the lenses that we use to view literature, is reader response. That's the main one. So you're going to have to know the 5 and 5, right? The 5 literary response types, not only know them, but know what they mean. And then you got to know the 5 causes of literary response. Okay? Thank you very much. Have a good day.